Tonight on Politics Unplugged, Governor Katie Hobbs looks back at the legislative session and what's in store for the future of Arizona. Plus, our panel weighs in on the rest of this week's headlines, including the debate over the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. Now on Politics Unplugged.
Good evening. I'm Political Editor Dennis Welch, and this is Politics Unplugged. The legislative session has wrapped, and Governor Katie Hobbs managed to reach an agreement on a new state budget with legislative Republicans avoiding a state government shutdown. I sat down to talk with the governor about the top issues facing the state. Thank you very much for joining us here, Governor. I know you're very busy, a lot going on. I know you definitely want to talk about the $17 billion budget you just signed, but there's some more pressing issues right now as we speak. We record earlier in the week, but as we speak right now, the Senate just passed a massive bill that the president has been calling his Big Beautiful Bill. It's passed out of the Senate. It's now in the hands of the House. And you delivered a very stark warning about that bill. Essentially, you're saying hundreds of thousands of people in Arizona are going to lose health care coverage, that tens of thousands of Arizonans could go hungry because they're not going to be getting the food assistance out there. And that's just kind of the start of all this. You also said that there's not much the state can do about that. Explain that.
Look, these are federal funds, and we support the programs with less state funds. But we rely on the federal funds to support the programs to the extent that they serve Arizonans, and we just don't have the funding to backfill these massive cuts. And
we've seen some estimates, some scorecards that put in Arizona upwards of 365,000 people could lose Medicaid. That's 20% of the Medicaid rolls in Arizona. Was there anything that the state should have been doing? Because this budget wasn't a surprise. It's been coming. We've known about this for a while. You just negotiated that budget. Was there something the state could have been doing beforehand to try to prepare for these cuts if they are enacted?
Well, Congress has been debating this bill for a long time, and we've made very clear the members of Congress know the impacts this will have. Every member of our delegation has numbers in their district of how many people this will impact, and not just the Medicaid beneficiaries or SNAP beneficiaries, but the hospitals and healthcare centers in their districts that will close as a result of this. That affects access to healthcare for a lot more Arizonans than the hundreds of thousands we know are going to directly lose their health care. They have these numbers, and I think the question needs to be directed at them. What do they think we should do about it? Because we can't provide the care if we don't have these federal funds. And why are they voting for this bill to extend massive tax breaks to billionaires?
And what are the numbers that you're seeing? You guys are looking through this. What could this bill cost Arizona? Because it's just not people getting kicked off of the Medicaid rolls and whatnot. There's also tax revenues that the states aren't going to, because there's cuts to Social Security, taxes paid on that and things like that. That could hurt the state budget, correct?
Right. So the bill keeps changing, and so we don't have exact numbers, but we know that the hit is huge, and it's going to affect not just directly Medicaid beneficiaries, but a lot of areas in the state.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit too. I know in the budget, the state budget you passed, you've been touted about things that you've done for border security and that. But this bill also, offers up billions of dollars for border enforcement. They're talking about building more detention facilities, the wall, completing the wall, hiring more agents. Was it necessary to include anything in the state budget, given the fact that this federal budget wants to put in hundreds of billions of dollars?
Well, I think it's important for us to be able to use state resources in the way that best allows our local law enforcement to protect their communities. And they've been using the state resources in the border security funds to go after cartel activity that's impacting border cities like drug trafficking and human smuggling. And we'll be able to continue to do that. But we also have built good partnerships with the federal government, and we're doing a lot of coordination there. And so I'm hopeful that these funds will help us continue to do that.
Okay, and let's talk a little bit more about the border enforcement we're seeing from the federal level. We've seen ICE raids across the country. We've seen them here in Arizona. We've seen Donald Trump federalize the National Guards. Are you willing to work with the White House on these raids to get that done? Because we've seen neighboring California, obviously, Governor Newsom there has been fighting the administration. What's your plan if that happens?
Yeah, no, the president ran on going after criminals and deporting criminals. And that is what we should be doing. That's where law enforcement efforts should be focused. I know that when I talk with local law enforcement, that's where they want the efforts to be directed. I've made it clear I don't support the indiscriminate raids, and we'll cross that bridge when it comes to it. I think there's certainly very deliberate attacks on the more democratic states.
And let's talk one last thing too. There's been a lot of attention given to the way the raids are carried out. You've seen these ICE agents or people purportedly part of ICE,
yep.
But we don't know for sure because some of them are covered with masks. I want to get your thoughts, just in general, when you see that, on TVs. Is this something that should be allowed to happen with law enforcement agents going after people, snatching them off of the streets with their faces covered?
I think it's very concerning, and I think it goes to just the violation of people's rights that we're seeing. I think people have a right to know who is detaining them or arresting them, and we've seen a lot of liberties taken with people's rights.
Yeah, and some people say it's about accountability. If you got your face covered, that maybe you're not going to be held accountable if something goes wrong. But other people do say it's like, well, look, these raids are controversial. They have friends, family. They need to be protected. What do you say when someone says that to you?
Well, I certainly think we need to protect law enforcement. I think we're seeing a lot of things in the way that these raids are carried out that are concerning. And should concern all of us about upholding people's rights. Okay,
let's pivot now. Let's get back to the budget because I know you really want to be talking about that because this was something that you guys had to do. It's the one constitutional function of the legislature is to pass a state budget.
Yes.
Almost $18 billion budget. You billed it as the Arizona's promise. That this is another step toward that. So for you, what's the elevator pitch? What's the big accomplishment out of this budget for the average everyday Arizonan?
Well, if you go back to the vision that I laid out for Arizona in my State of the State, I talked about the Arizona Promise, delivering on opportunity, freedom, and security for Arizonans to be able to thrive. And this budget really hit a lot of those priorities that we laid out. And we are able to come together with the grown-ups who want to govern and work out a compromise budget that delivers on public safety, on border security, on lowering costs, on investing in childcare, which is a huge need. We made the biggest investment in childcare since the Great Recession. So a lot to be proud of there.
Before we get into more policy, I am kind of interested. You're negotiating. This is your third budget you negotiated. What's the biggest lesson you learned in negotiating and working with the legislature in a situation like this from your first year to this year?
Well, I think that we continue to show what we can accomplish if we are willing to work together, put the politics aside, and focus on the challenge in front of us, in this case, the budget, and delivering for the constituents who elected all of us to be there, whether it's me or the legislators. And I think there were folks who tried to detract from that process and focus on the politics and not realizing that I have to sign the budget, and so it has to be a budget that I'm willing to sign. And they were willing to threaten a government shutdown over that, and I'm really proud of being able to overcome that.
And still ahead, I'll get into the key points of the new budget with Governor Hobbs when Politics Unplugged continues. Welcome back to Politics Unplugged. What can be done to make housing more affordable in our state? We get into that and more. Here's the rest of my interview with Governor Katie Hobbs. And so getting back into the policy details of this, one of the big highlights you've been touting is making Arizona more affordable. I can't think of anything in Arizona that's become less affordable than housing. What is in this budget? Correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see a lot in this budget. If you're a 20, 30-year-old, maybe early 40s, looking to buy a house, what's in this budget that can make or help them do that?
So we made some significant investments when it comes to addressing housing insecurity, particularly on homeless services and the Homes for Heroes program to help address veterans homelessness. Those are important initiatives. I know we need to do more on housing. It's why the fight isn't done on low-income housing tax credits and getting a new low-income housing tax credit passed so that we can build more affordable housing.
Okay, and then on education, the education front, you've gotten some criticism, particularly from people in your own party, said, like, look, she hasn't gotten any more guardrails on the Empowerment Scholarship account, the voucher program. You are not in favor of that. But what could be done? What could have been done this year, if anything, on this? I mean, I do understand that Republicans, this is, for lack of a better word, a die on the hill issue for them down at the legislature. Is there some horse trading that could have been done to get some sort of guardrails on this program? Because as it stands right now, a lot of the people, the largest growth of students are students who've never been in the public school system, meaning their parents had previously been paying their kids' way 100% to go to private school, but now the state is subsidizing that. So, I mean, I think an income gap is something a lot of folks have been wanting to see you deliver on.
No, this is a boondoggle, and I've said that. I haven't minced words about that. It's a problem, and it is why they have chosen this as their hill to die on when they want to be out there defending the misspending that we continue to see happening. People using it for $16,000 cellos or whatever else that we've seen. This is what they're defending when we have a responsibility to make sure that every student in the state has access to high quality education. This isn't that. We'll continue the fight.
Okay, and then Proposition 1, 2, 3, that was supposed to be put on the ballot to continue that, because money is about to run out, or it has run out already. It needs to be continued, and that is money from the state land trust that has been siphoned. Some of it siphoned over into education coffers. Is that something you come back next year and get on the ballot, or is this just a done deal at this point?
No, I don't think it's a done deal. And we did backfill the Prop 1, 2, 3 fiscal cliff. We did backfill that in the budget this year. So any renewal would be additional funding. And I think there definitely is still an appetite to do that. We're going to continue to work with educators, with the business community who understands this is important, and hopefully get something to the ballot that is bipartisan and will get the voter support. Okay,
let's wrap here on this with the budget now that the session is over. There was a story in the Arizona Mirror said that they went through the over 200 bills that you signed into law this year, and they found 10 bills that are very directly linked to right-wing agenda for the so-called, Project 2025. Wanted to talk to you a little bit about that and get your reaction to that story and a couple of the bills in particular. But just first of all, your reaction to that story.
I mean, I think it's ridiculous and not focused on the right things. I signed hundreds of bills this session. I don't know the exact number, but they were all bipartisan. And so I'm focused on addressing the most important issues in our state. If a bill gets through the legislature and has bipartisan support, then that's a good reason to support it.
One of the bills they cited was the restricting access to pornographic material for younger kids out there. There would be an age verification on this. You voted a similar or an identical bill last year, but signed it this year. What changed?
So in the interim, I've heard from a lot of parents who are increasingly concerned about materials that their kids have access to. We know from studies the harm that can, how that can impact kids negatively. And this bill, I think, had reasonable guardrails.
Okay, and then another one they did mention too that's been in the headlines a lot is banning protests or overnight protests at the universities. Do you think that was really wise? We've seen a lot of protesters at universities targeted by the current administration. Some have been, some of them are even facing deportation. There's at least one student in New York that is. Why would you try to limit these protests? I mean, this is college. Kids want to go out and express their freedom of speech. Like, why eliminate this, and why doesn't this limit free speech?
This bill didn't do anything to limit free speech, and in fact really just allows universities or underscores their ability to enforce policies that are already in place. All three of the universities have rules against encampments. This allows them to enforce those rules.
Okay, and final question about the budget this year. How would you sum up the legislative session? What would be the headline that Governor Hobbs would give on this past 6 months?
I think we had a great session. I'm really proud of the bipartisan budget that we delivered. But on top of that, the protection of DD services for the 60,000 Arizona families who rely on them, that was a huge win. The bill that allows us to transfer agricultural land to lower water use projects like home building, which is going to allow us to build more homes, create jobs, address housing affordability. Those are two really big wins on top of the budget.
We'll end it right there. Thank you very much, Governor.
Thank you.
And up next, I'm bringing in our panel to talk about all of this week's major headlines, including the battle over the so-called Big Beautiful Bill. That's next on Politics Unplugged. Welcome back to Politics Unplugged. The top political story of the week is the debate over what the president's calling his big, beautiful bill. As we tape on Thursday, we don't know its fate in the House. And here to talk about that and the rest of this week's headlines, Republican consultant Doug Cole and Democratic consultant Matt Grotsky. Thanks for being here, both of you guys. Let's start with the big, beautiful bill. You heard the governor express dire, grave warnings about what could happen to Arizona if this is enacted. And as we're talking right now, it looks like it's heading in that direction. She's talking about hundreds of thousands of people getting cut off of Medicaid, losing food assistance programs. State revenues could shrink from this and really damage the balanced budget. They passed her budgets in the future that they're going to put together. She says there's nothing the state can do about that. You've been a student of the executive arts for a long time. You've worked with governors. Is that true?
Well, when you talk about Arizona's Medicaid program, which is we refer to it as Access, it's a waiver program, and so everything that we do with that program has to go through a process with CMS, which is the federal agency that runs this. So there's not a lot of leeway, and we are an expansion state. So during the Affordable Care Act in the Obama administration, we expanded the Medicaid population eligibility here in Arizona. Now you got to realize a quarter of Arizonans are on Access, a quarter. And a third of those that live in rural areas that are adults, working age adults in rural Arizona, are also on Access. Last time I looked at the electoral map, and I know my Democrat colleague across the table here is absent Flagstaff and Bisbee, rural Arizona is pretty red MAGA. And so you take a third of that's when we're going to start seeing consequences. But as we all know, it has a delayed enactment, and those effects of these Medicaid changes will come after the midterm.
Yeah, and they're staggering the implementation of some of these things. So essentially what's going to happen is you're going to see tax cuts for working Americans, and most of those tax cuts, are, according to analysts, are going to benefit the wealthy. But what you're going to see is then after the midterms is when you start seeing the cuts to Medicaid and SNAP and those food programs like that. So is that kind of a tacit admission then that this carries some real political pitfalls for the Republican Party?
It's an overt admission, and then the big thing at the end of the day here is this bill is going to pass. This is going to pass. I know that as we sit here right now, Minority Leader Jeffries is in there talking and filibustering. But the reality is this is going to be law, and it's incumbent on Democrats to go out there until the midterms and tell the story of what this is going to do with the tax cuts for the wealthy and the folks that are going to eventually get stripped off of Medicaid. So it is an admission, and we're just going to have to make sure we tell that story.
And I think that was a Freudian slip when you said Speaker Jeffries, because recent history says of the last four midterms, the last five midterms, of the sitting president's party has lost four of them.
Yep.
And in the last three, that has happened. So very well may be that the House will flip, because that's what's happened for the five last times.
Yep.
And talk to us a little bit too about the economic impacts of this. We've had people on the show talk about if this bill was to pass again, it looks like it's going to. You could see rural hospitals shut down. Yeah. And if anybody who's traveled into rural Arizona knows that there's a lot of business that's built up around these hospitals. They're large employers. There's small businesses that go up around there. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, correct. I mean, today the employment numbers came out today.
Sure.
And they exceeded exceeded expectations, and it's been a banner week for the stock market. But if you dug down deep into what those increase in employment numbers said, the biggest growth sector was the healthcare industry sector. And so that states that that's a growth industry, but yet if these Medicaid cuts come through, then that's going to affect that sector, even though it's the biggest growth sector right now of employment.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the jobs report because, it's a good transition. I was going to ask Matt about this. A lot of, sky is falling coming from Democrats and opponents of this bill. Is that warranted? Because for most of the year, all we've been hearing about is how the president's tariff policies is going to kickstart a recession.
Yeah.
So far, we haven't seen that. And again, as Doug mentioned, we saw 147,000 jobs added to the economy in the month of June. So it looks like the economy is humming right along despite some of the dire forecasts. Could the same be said about this?
I'm waiting for the revised reports, but remember, these things all operate on a delay. And we've seen the erratic, gyrating behavior of the economy for the last several months because of the erratic policies. So it's going to be a little delayed until we see the full breadth of the effects, but I think we still need to tell that story because the results are it's still going to have colossal ramifications over the next year. Just might not feel it in the immediate months afterwards. So I think we need to keep talking about it.
Yeah, and we've got some serious political consequences, some interesting votes to be watching. Particularly I'm looking at how is Juan Ciscomani, how is David Schweiker, two Republican congressmen in swing districts. How are they going to vote on this? It looks like they're probably going to vote for this. We'll have to wait and see. But they could face some political blowback on that. You've also got another congressman, Andy Biggs, who's running for governor. How would that play out with those types of candidates next year?
Well, they have to be very careful because those are, especially District 1 and District 6, those are the swing districts here in Arizona. And especially with Juan Ciscomani, his opponent the last two cycles has run against him on being more against more extreme policies with the MAGA, and chiefly on Medicaid and Medicare cuts. So he has no choice, though, but I would be stunned if he didn't vote for the bill, which it probably has happened by the time the show shows. But he has no choice but to vote for the bill. The question is, what comes later? What does he do if it's so apparent that it's going to cause rural hospitals in his district, which he has a huge rural district, what he does to protect those hospitals, not only for the folks that are showing up there, but who work there and all the industries that support those hospitals in rural Arizona.
Yeah, speaking of politics, we just talked to the governor. She is up for re-election. We all know that. How does this budget, this legislative session this year, set her up for next year as she looks to keep her job for another 4 years?
Yeah, well, in a state where we have a voter registration disadvantage between ourselves and Republicans, it's imperative.
That's not getting any better.
I know, it's getting worse.
I know.
Don't
remind
me, bud. But yeah, no, she's got to highlight that she can pass a bipartisan budget, and she's done that. We've avoided a shutdown despite some of the shenanigans by other legislators in the legislature. So I think it helps her. But as a Democratic brand, as we head into next year, we need to tie this bill and their priorities to every Republican that's on the ballot, because that's our opportunity to persuade voters.
Yeah, and how do you think, let's end on this, how do you think the governor did this year? It looks like they avoided a shutdown, a potential crisis of their own making. Yeah. But how do you think she did this year compared to the prior 2 years?
Well, I think she's growing into this job. I think that it was very wise of her to hitch her horse to the Senate Republicans, especially Senate President Warren Peterson, and get the budget done. And I think Warren Peterson, the Senate President, made an unbelievable speech on the floor and called out shock jocks and troll farms, and that passing a budget with just Republican is easy. He did the hard work. And I thought that was a turning point in the leadership of Warren Peterson with that speech.
All right, we'll have to wrap it there. That is all the time we have. Be sure to join us next week for more Politics Unplugged. Good night.